Welcome back to another Wharf Wide Web. Today we're looking at steam on the wharf. Our Duke was quite keen on steam, and steamers who had proven they wouldn't explode were invited to give performances on the canal. In around 1797, John Smith of St Helens had created a steam-powered barge and demonstrated her capabilities by taking passengers along the Sankey Canal to Newton races, and a week later she crossed the Mersey into Runcorn and went up to Manchester. She was such an oddity that she drew a crowd of people following her up the towpath, and by the time she got to Manchester the crowd was shoulder to shoulder and getting rowdy. Mr Smith tried to disperse the crowds by telling them that only people who had bought a ticket could actually come on board, which led to a band of enthusiastic mechanics to turn pirate and seize her, and almost end up blowing her up. Descriptions of her are not all that flattering, and perhaps explain why she garnered so much attention. The oars performing 18 strokes a minute by application of steam only. The form and motion of the oars is not easily described. The vessel had on her an engine on the old atmospheric principle, and was worked with a beam, connecting rod, double crank in the horizontal line, with 7 paddles on each side which propelled her after the rate of about 2 miles an hour. The descriptions of her team didn't inspire much awe either. John Smith was a rude self-taught mechanic and was supported by Thomas Baldwin, at that time of St Helens, and the first aeronaut who ever ascended in a balloon either in this or the adjoining counties. But she had made enough of an impression that experiments were made by the Duke's team, and by 1799 a new paddle steamer set out from Worsley Yard on her maiden voyage, and promptly had to stop and have a hinge put in her funnel because it was too tall. We don't know what the Duke named her, but the boatman scornfully christened her Bonaparte. She was a plodder, only moving at 1 mile per hour, but she did manfully take a train of 8 boats with a combined load of about 200 tons of coal into Manchester. However, her deep draught and flailing paddles were a risk to the canal bed, and she was quietly decommissioned after her trial, and the engine converted into a pump named Old Nancy. It took another couple of years before William Symington finally cracked it with the Charlotte Dundas in Scotland, and having been shown a model of the little tug, the Duke was so impressed that he ordered 8. Unfortunately for the story of the Bridgewater, the Duke died shortly after the order was placed, and the new trustees of the canal had neither the courage nor the forethought of the Duke, and immediately cancelled the order. Steamers popped up on all the neighbouring waterways in the next half-century, but the Bridgewater trustees steadfastly refused them on the grounds of damaging the canal. They were occasionally lured into allowing trials, with perhaps the most bizarre one being in 1847, when a cable was laid from Prestonbrook to Runcorn and a barge carrying a steam-powered drum winch pulled herself backwards and forwards on the cable, towing whatever was hitched behind her. Prestonbrook, meanwhile, was embracing steam. In the 1840s, someone had successfully persuaded the trustees that engines could lift more than men, and in 1849 a pair of single-cylinder condensing beam engines were boated down from the Worsley Works and fitted in Prestonbrook and Norton warehouses. We don't know much about the Norton one, but at Prestonbrook she had bevel wheels attached to vertical shafts powering the hoists, and long underground shafts reaching to the cranes on the waterside, and each one had a clutch to allow it to be worked independently. The beam was 10 feet long and the flywheel 11 feet wide, and in total she produced about 12 horsepower at 25 rpm. The drivers for the stationary engines found themselves surrounded by fascinated children on a regular basis, and when the Trent and Mersey brought steam tugs in to work at the tunnels in 1864, they too were mobbed by kiddies wanting a go. The tunnels of Prestonbrook, Saltersford and Barnton had increasingly been bottlenecks as the passing boats had to leg through each one, and the introduction of tunnel tugs reduced this problem. Each tug had a steerer and an engineman, and they worked from 6 in the morning to 9 at night to a timetable 6 days a week. The fires were kept in overnight every night bar for Saturday, and the boiler tubes were swept out daily. The boilers got a weekly washout, and they never filled with water from the canal because it was slightly salty, being this close to the salt witches. Although the Prestonbrook tug lived in the little dock built for her at Dutton, she got her water from a tank on the Prestonbrook side of the tunnel, fed from the brook itself. You can see in these pictures the tugs for Barnton and Saltersford had little guide wheels fitted to the hull, as the tunnels have slight bends in them. The Prestonbrook tug, working a much straighter tunnel, didn't need them. Despite constructing ventilation shafts, all the tunnels suffered from the amount of smoke produced. The tunnel keeper's cottage at Preston Brook suffered so much with the perpetual smoke wafting from the tunnel mouth that they bricked up all the canal side windows. The tunnel tugs stayed steam-powered to the end of their lives in the mid-1940s, by which time they were superfluous in the motorboat age. As none of the tunnels are wide enough to allow two boats to pass, the tugs were replaced by a traffic light system. Today boats are supposed to use a timing system, only entering the tunnel at the correct time for their direction of travel, but it is occasionally ignored and one or the other will have to try and reverse out again. The Bridgewater eventually got tugs of its own, but not until the trustees sold up to the new Bridgewater Navigation Company. The first tug arrived in 1874, followed by 25 more over the course of the next 7 years. The crew was mostly 3 strong, worked week-long shifts and went home at weekends. They generally took 4 barges at a time on the Bridgewater and 6 on the Manchester Ship Canal, but they were quite capable of taking more. The little packets didn't stay steam for very long, all things considered, and 19 were converted to diesel power in the 1920s, with the others being scrapped. The surviving fleet lasted onto the modern age before they too were decommissioned. None survive in preservation, though a couple of hulls still exist. The Manchester Ship Canal in fact managed to cling to steam for the longest time of all the local area, with the tug Daniel Adamson remaining in fully working order as both a working tug and as a luxury inspection vessel for the company until 1984. Danny still exists, lives only a stone's throw away from Preston Brook, and is always keen to make new friends if you would like to learn more about steamships. Rail steam may actually have first arrived at Preston Brook by water, with steam engine Novelty travelling from London in the care of Pickfords for the Rainhill trials of 1829, and it being their gauging that allowed the judges to know exactly how much she weighed. Her engineers had apparently thrown her together in a mere 7 weeks before the trials, and she hadn't actually been tested. Lack of testing ultimately led to her being withdrawn when she broke down and there wasn't enough time to repair her. If they'd had a little more time to prepare, rail history could have been very different, as she was both the lightest and the fastest of the entrants, and she certainly won the hearts of the crowd. Preston Brook gained a railway station in 1837 when the railway itself was opened. Contrary to popular imagining, the railway wasn't the death knell of the canals. This railway had a goods yard directly on the canal side, with a siding just for rail canal transshipment. It was only 500 yards from the passenger station itself, and the railway and the canal coexisted quite well together until the roads overtook them both. Road steam was a fairly regular visitor to the area, with agricultural engines passing through on a circuitry route at key times in the calendar after John Fowler's ploughing engines were perfected in the 1860s, and road engines coming through as the early HGVs and highway maintenance. There were issues, however, with the roads not being quite suitable for the big vehicles of that modern age, and accidents did happen. And on that topical note we'll finish today's video. Join me tomorrow for the last of our Heritage Open Days films, when we'll look to the skies.